So we're starting the classical period, part one, introduction. I'll probably spend the majority of today's class just doing the introduction. It's a lot of different parts. And then a bit more quickly, we'll do comparisons of civilizations. And then the last part, expansion and integration. If I don't finish everything today, then I'll push what the leftovers to next Thursday. But let's see how much we covered today. The classical period starts from around 1000 BCE and it goes to about 500 CE. That's roughly about 1500 years. And just like with the early civilizations, to make things easier for us, we use more specific dates. 1046 BCE, you already know what that is now, right? That was when the Zhou dynasty was founded. So we use that in terms of world history as the beginning of the classical period. And 476 is when the Roman Empire fell. So that marks the end of the classical period. Please don't get confused because I'll talk about these things. When we talk about the classical period, we can talk about the classical period of a kingdom, a different civilization. Different kingdoms will have different classical periods. So talking about a classical period for, let's say, like India may not be the same as the classical period for world history. Okay, so please don't get confused. We use the same term, classical period, but when applied to like a single country, the numbers will change. This period that we call the classical period is crucial in world history because key characteristics of major civilizations took shape during the classical period. Sometimes we call what took shape during this period the great traditions. The great traditions. The early civilizations mostly disappeared, except we said maybe China, right? Aspects of that ancient civilization still survives today. The others disappeared. But the classical period is different because what developed during the classical period is still with us. They're very much still alive with us, even though, like, let's say the Roman Empire disappeared, right? A lot of what developed during that time is still treasured today. That's why some people are classicists, I think you call them, classicism. It's this desire of some people to look back at the classical period with a lot of fondness, right? With a lot of respect. Our current society is decaying, right? We're rotting. We need to go back to a better, more glorious time when people were more, noble and maybe even more intelligent. That's the classical period. So we think. So we think. I don't think that is true, but some people are classicist in that they value the classical period more than the modern times, especially in music, right? We talk about classical music. Some people treasure classical music. I'm not saying classical music is from this period. What we call classical music is much later, right? I don't know much about music, but it's probably like, I don't know, 16th, 17th, 18th century music. But we say classical. In the same way, the classical period to a lot of people's minds is the glorious time for us to like look back with envy. I wish I was, living in the times of the Roman Empire, that kind of thing. Uh, the civilizations during the classical period, they all grew from the river valley civilizations, but they all expanded. That's one common element of all the classical civilizations, is that these societies always they were all river valley civilizations, and then they always expanded and also moved. They all moved. Well, many of them moved. So here are some examples of the classical civilizations or the classical societies. China's Zhou dynasty expanded from north of the Yellow River to the southern regions, down to the Yangtze River, and the dynasty formed what is now known as the Middle Kingdom. So this is when China began to see itself as the Middle Kingdom, meaning they were at the center of the world, right? China is at the center. Everyone revolves around China. Uh, and maybe they had reason to think that, right? China was a glorious place to be in. So Huanghe, right, the Yellow River, and then the Yangtze River at down south, and this whole area became part of the Zhou dynasty, which, by the way, I think was the longest dynasty in Chinese history. Let's see, the Indian the Indian classical civilization. The Harappans, we say they disappeared, right? The Harappans, they were up here, right? Indus Valley, and then they disappeared. They were replaced by the Indo-Aryan migrants, whether they were invaders or migrants or maybe both. This period is known as the Vedic period. The Vedic period. We call it the Vedic period because this is when we got the Veda. Is it Vedas? Veda, the Hindu scriptures. This is when we got the scriptures. There were many small kingdoms, and then the Maurya dynasty. That's one of the classical kingdoms. Maurya dynasty united most of the Indian subcontinent. And so this is the Maurya dynasty. The date here is 265 BCE. That's when it basically united all of India, except for the southern part. Uh, I think I said I don't know too much about India, but I think the southernmost part is what we now call the Tamil, Ta Tamil Tamil people, and they were never really conquered. So they were always the most resistant. They never got integrated into these different Indian empires until the British. Apparently, the British finally got rid of their independence when it colonized the entire Indian, do we say continent or subcontinent? Indian subcontinent. Uh, as Indian civilization spread, its center shifted east from the Indus Valley to the Ganges River basin. So Indus Valley is here, and then the center of its civilization moved toward the Ganges River southeast. That became the center of the Indian civilization during the classical times. And here we have the Mediterranean civilization. We say it started with the Mycenaeans. I'm sorry, I will not. I will get these things wrong. Mycenaeans. That is the beginning of the Mediterranean civilization in southern Greece. So that is southern Greece. Again, like I said, I'm terrible at geography. So this is where the Mycenaean Empire or the kingdom was, and they basically spread throughout the Mediterranean, um, spread along the shorelines of Eastern Mediterranean and westward to North Africa and Southern Europe. So they just spread everywhere around the Mediterranean. And then eventually, this Greek civilization was overtaken by the Romans from Italy. And Romans basically took over the entire region. So that is how the civilization grew and spread in the Mediterranean. Uh, right, the Mediterranean is here. The Mesopotamian civilization is here, right? This is the Fertile Crescent. If you look at this, that's the Fertile Crescent. The Persian Empire was an exception. They were exceptional because they stayed close to their river valley roots. The Achaemenid, I'm sure that's how you say it. The Achaemenid Empire expanded greatly to become the largest empire in the classical Near East and the Mediterranean. So this is the Persian Empire, the Achaemenids, Achaemenid Empire around 500 BCE, and they were the largest empire in this region, the Mediterranean, and then to the east of the Mediterranean, jotting against India. So it was a huge, huge empire. And right, so this is around 500 BC. Just this is just an aside, but because I wrote it here, you have to study this. So Persia, these numbers are from Professor Stearns from his lectures. Persia, he said, is around 5.5 million square kilometers. That's huge. How big is South Korea? Who knows the land size of South Korea? I believe it's about 100,000 square kilometers. 100,000. That's the size of Korea. It's not such a small country, right? On the smaller side. So 100,000. Persia is 5.5 million. What is that? That's like 550 times the size. Huge empire. But it was not as big as China. China, Han Dynasty, at its height, was around 6 million square miles. That was around during the classical times. Han China had the biggest empire in terms of land mass. And then the third largest was the Roman Empire, around 5 million square miles. Now, these numbers are just very rough estimates. Some say like 4.5 is more accurate or something, but for us, it's 5 million. And then Maurya Empire, that's the classical Indian empire, was 4.5. So these were the four biggest empires during the classical times, classical period: China, Persia, Rome, and then Maurya Empire. So that was how these civilizations, they all grew from the river valley and then always expanded, increased their land size tremendously, all of them. So now we move to Chinese civilization. Chinese classical period, we say, starts with the Zhou dynasty. So that's 1046. And the classical period for China ends around 256 BCE. So you see, so please don't get confused. We said classical period ends at 476, we said, right? That's for world history. That's when Rome fell. But for China, its classical period, we say, ends in 256. That is when the Han dynasty fell. The Zhou dynasty. Oh, I'm sorry. What am I saying? I'm sorry. I'm sorry. My mistake. It's not 256 BCE. Uh, sorry, I'm confusing you. I'm sorry. I took that back. When did Han Dynasty fall? It was 200 something, but it wasn't BCE. It was CE, right? So to totally my mistake. Sorry. We're talking about just Zhou Dynasty. Zhou Dynasty fell at 256 BCE. I'm sorry. My mistake. 220? Can anybody scroll ahead? When did Han Dynasty fall? Is it 220? Okay, so 220 CE. So that's like over 200 years before the fall of Rome, right? So that's when the classical period for China ended, 220 CE. So Zhou Dynasty, the longest dynasty in Chinese history, was replaced by, I used to say Qin dynasty, and I realized that was wrong. It's not Qin, it's Qin dynasty. Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE. That is the shortest dynasty in Chinese history. Under Zhou, China was decentralized, landlord dominated, somewhat like a feudal system. And then it entered into this warring states period. And then Qin was the ultimate victor. And so it unified China for the first time. Uh, Unlike the Zhou dynasty, it was a very strong central government. It only lasted like 15 years. But people say Qin dynasty is very important because it was the first strong centralized government that unified all of China. This guy is pretty famous. Qin dynasty, yeah, very short-lived but significant. It unified China with a strong central government with an absolute ruler, Qin Shi Huang. You guys are probably familiar with the name. Qin Shi Huang, I don't know his real name. I knew it and I thought, I don't have to remember this. I don't have to know his real name. Because if I wrote it down, then you'd have to study it, right? But what happened was once he became king, he decided he would give himself a title that is higher than a king. King is it's like Wang, Wang, Wang in China, right? In Chinese, sorry, Chinese. And he wanted to be higher than a Wang. So he used this term from Chinese mythology, the Yellow Emperor that we talked about, right? Yellow Emperor is Huang Di, and that is the title he gave himself. So it's Qin Shi Huang Di is the official title that he gave himself. And we usually say, we don't say Huang Di, we just say Huang now, right? So Qin Shi Huang. I think in Korean we say Huang Jie, right? So that translates to emperor in English. But for the Chinese, emperor is really the yellow, what we call the yellow emperor, the mythological founding figure of Chinese history. So he called himself that. He wanted to connect himself with something divine or semi-divine. I am like the yellow emperor. Worship me. Well, not worship. He wanted to be the absolute ruler of all of China. And by all accounts, Qin Shi Huang was a terrible man, was a terrible tyrant. Uh, no wonder his dynasty only lasted 15 years. Very short time. But in that short span of time, he accomplished a lot of things and he did a lot of terrible things. Uh, I'm showing you this because this is world famous, right? In Xi'an, the province, and they discovered this. They dug it up. Uh, Qin Shi Huang's tomb. It's a huge castle. They discovered like 8,000 terracotta soldiers. And apparently, a lot of people died working to build this tomb. And some people got buried alive, apparently, like some of his concubines without children. They were locked inside to die with him. So, should I talk about him a little bit more? No, it's just so his importance isn't that he was, this great benevolent ruler, but that he created this strong central government and he became this absolute ruler. So ever since the Qin dynasty, all the dynasties that followed after Qin wanted to imitate the Qin because once you display a certain level of power, everyone who comes after you would want the same kind of thing. So he became an example of what an emperor should be, what a Huangdi should be. So all the others that followed imitated Qin. And the perfect example of that, in a good way, not in a negative way, not the terrible things, but in a good way, that emulated the Qin was the Han Dynasty. So 202 to 220 CE. And so with the demise of the Han Dynasty, that closes the classical period for China. So at first, when Han Dynasty took over, they seemed to revert back to the feudal system, but gradually, because this guy, what's his name, Liu Bang or Liu Bang, he was this sneaky guy who at first said, "Oh, yes, yes, let us all be friends." And then once he consolidated power, he continued the system set by the Qin. He became an emperor like Qin Shi Huang, of course, but much more benevolent and much kinder. He was widely admired and regarded, and Han Dynasty, the period that of the Han Dynasty is regarded as the first golden age of China. The Han Dynasty was the first and maybe the best period in Chinese history. Uh, any Chinese student here? Anyone Chinese? Okay. If I say something wrong, please, point it out to me. So, from what I know, the Han Dynasty is when China achieved its golden age, and that is why uh, uh, Chinese people, even today, they call themselves the people of Han, right? They call it, of course, we call ourselves Han민족, but that's a different Han, I think, right? It's a different Han. But people in China, they identify themselves as the people of Han, and that's this Han Dynasty. So that is China. Oh, what do I have this? Oh, right, right. There's an incredible story of how Liu Bang came to be the emperor of Han Dynasty. It's a very famous story. They call it Chu Han uh, Chu Han contention. I think they call it Chu Han contention or struggle. In Korean, it's famous too. They call it Chohanji, I think, right? So they tell stories about this time. I got this off the internet. It's like some kind of game. And yeah, this is the rivalry between Liu Bang and Xiang Yu, I think Xiang Yu. Liu Bang is a sneaky guy. He's always like, "Oh yes, don't worry about me. Let's all get along." And Xiang Yu is this unbeatable warrior general, unbeatable warrior, and so by all accounts, he should have been the king, but somehow, because of their like he had like some character flaws. He eventually lost to Liu Bang, but he had a beautiful, not wife, a concubine, a consort, and she was like the most beautiful woman in Chinese history or something. And the story of Xiang Yu and what's her name? Uwh, I think Uwh is her name or something. A very famous story. Like she does a sword dance and then she kills herself, right? And then Sheng Yu he fights his way out and then but he commits suicide as well. This story of Shang Yu and Uwh turned into a musical. The Peking Opera, they do that musical. They're telling the story of Shang Yu and Uwh. Farewell, my concubine. That's their story, right? You know the thing, heavily painted, and they go, and the thing I'm talking about, Peking opera. Well, that's the story of Shang Yu and Yu Ji. So that's China. The Indian civilization starts with the Muri. Oh, I'm sorry. Before the classical period, so we have the Vedic period, as I said, with the Indo-Aryans. So that went on for about 1,000 years, 1500 to 500 BCE, known for the creation of the Indian culture as we know it today, actually, and its religious traditions, the Vedas, the Hindu scriptures. So that's why this period is called the Vedic period. I don't want to get into this too much because I don't want to say anything that's inaccurate, wrong, but from what I know, the Indo-Aryans, notice Indo-Aryans were of a different race. Um, I know we're conflating different historical traditions here, but they are Aryans. They were lighter skinned people, right? And they immigrated or invaded from the northwestern part of India, and they basically took over the subcontinent of India. And they're the ones who established the religious tradition of Brahmanism, and then that turned into Hinduism, right? So the Hinduism that we have today is the work of the Indo-Aryans. I think scholars say, well, this developed over a very long period of time. So there was a mixing of the races. But now I could be wrong, because my scholarship on this specific area is not deep, and different people will have different opinions about this. But this whole thing with the caste system, and we'll talk about this later, the caste system in India. You have the four categories, and then you have the untouchables, right? The untouchables. It caused a lot of problem for India throughout history. And even today, there is still a side of India where this caste system casts a dark shadow over the entire nation because of this centuries-old tradition of this caste system that was established during the time of the Vedic period, where the Indo-Aryans were ruling India. Right. So Maurya Empire, that is the beginning of the classical period for India, uh, because we say Maurya Empire unified India. It was the largest empire in Indian history. Its most famous emperor was Ashoka, the first ruler to embrace Buddhism. Yeah, so when it says unified most of India, it basically conquered all of India except the southern tip, where again the Tamil people resisted. Ashoka, he um, is one of the most famous of the Maurya Empire because it's a fascinating story. I think this is an old uh, Hindi movie, Ashoka the Great. It says the mighty warring emperor who transformed into a messenger of peace, nonviolence, and love, the great Indian emperor Ashoka. The story is that he was a very warlike king, and he had a lot of wars, and he slaughtered a lot of people, and then he became disillusioned with the entire thing, the whole thing, the game that you play, the game of empire that he played, that he had to play. And he just became disillusioned with the whole thing. And then he became enlightened. He learned about Buddhism, and then he became an enlightened ruler. And he saw that violence is not a solution to anything. So he became like the most loving, kind, and generous king in Mauryan Empire. The story is that the time of Ashoka was when Maurya Empire achieved its heights, like the most the largest land size and all that. But then since Ashoka, Maurya Empire started to go down because it became a peaceful place, right? Uh, so the decline of the Maurya Empire began with also Ashoka because of the kind of person he became. Beloved, sure, respected, highly regarded, but uh, they stopped expanding and began to be, a more loving empire. After the Maurya Empire, let's see if I have this correct. After the fall of the Maurya Empire, India fragmented, and for a long time, for like a few hundred years, I think, India remained fragmented until the Gupta Empire, where Gupta Empire reunified India. And Gupta Empire's period is often referred to as the Golden Age of India, because during this time, from 320 to 550 CE. So that's about 230 years, I guess. During this time, India saw remarkable cultural and intellectual achievements, a great flowering of Indian civilization in art, science, and literature. Apparently, this was the time when they developed the concept of zero. So it was an Indian invention, but then the Arabs kind of took that, and then Europeans thought zero was an um, Arab invention. So they see it as an Arab invention, but it was really the Indians that first developed the idea of zero. So that is the Gupta Empire. I'm sorry I'm going through this so quickly because I want to talk more about the Mediterranean civilization. I want to talk about this a bit more. Let me just check the time. We want to spend a bit more time with the Mediterranean civilization simply because a lot of people see this as the beginning of Western civilization, right? They trace back their history to the Greeks, and this is the beginning of the Greek civilization, well, um, the Greek civilization. So the classical Mediterranean civilization started with the Greek city-states known as the Archaic period around 800 BCE. So I want you to get the picture clear about the time periods. So the classical period for the Greeks began around 800 BCE. Oh, shoot. I think I misspoke again. Sorry. Let me take that back. It's the Mediterranean civilization starting around 800 BCE. The classical period for Greeks began around 480. Sorry. So let me take that back. It's not the Greek, it's the Mediterranean civilization. And we want to separate those two. Mediterranean is the entire region, and Greek civilization is a part of that, right? So now I'm kind of jumping ahead because I made this mistake. So the Greek civilization and then the Roman civilization, they uh, they they meld together to form what's known as the Greco-Roman civilization. And what historians say is the Greco-Roman civilization is the most clear expression of the Mediterranean civilization because around this time, you actually have many different civilizations, right? You have the remnants of the Mesopotamian civilization, right? So you have different peoples, different societies, but then what we say is the Mediterranean civilization's characteristics ultimately was best expressed by the Greco-Roman civilization. And that started with the Greeks. So sorry for that little confusion there. So the classical Mediterranean civilization is 800 BCE. Classical Greek uh, period starts at 480. Phew. Okay, so it starts with what's known as the Archaic period, and then that's followed by the Greco-Persian Wars. And when the Athenians and Spartans, the Greeks beat back the Persians, that's when the classical period for the Greeks started. The rise of Athens, and then the Peloponnesian Wars, and then the conquest by Alexander the Great. That is all still part of the classical Greek period. And then with the death of Alexander the Great, the classical period for the Greeks ends there. And then after that is called the Hellenistic period, which is apparently, I don't know why exactly, because Hellenistic, that's still Greek, right? But maybe it's because Hellenistic is Greek plus other societies. So that's considered a separate period. And that lasts about 300 years. And then they all get taken over by the Romans. So here, so that's the slide, right? This is what you have to study. So just so that you have a clear picture of what's going on here. So this is before the classical period. And like I said, I want to talk about this a little bit more because uh, at least, Westerners, they think this is more important somehow than the other kingdoms, the other empires, the other civilizations. So it's a bit of a bias, I know, but so we want to be clear as to this period. So one of the earlier civilizations, we talked about the early civilizations, right? Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and the Harappans and the Chinese civilization. In the Mediterranean area, one of the earlier civilizations there was what we called the Mycenaean civilization. Mycenaean. This is a city, ancient Mycenae. And this period, so this is part of the early civilization, right? But notice that the time period is 1600 to 1100 BCE. So in terms of the early civilizations, this is like really late. This is toward the end of the early civilization period, right? So this is when the Greeks first got going, the Mycenaean civilization. This is the forerunner of the what we know as the Greek civilization, what the classical Greek civilization, the Mycenaean civilization. And I think that was the picture that I showed you, the blue part, the southern part of Greece, what is now Greece, right? This is the stuff of Greek legends. Mycenaean, one of the Mycenaean kings was a guy named Agamemnon. Oh, you recognize the name? Agamemnon is the king who led the Greek warriors to fight with the Trojans. So this is the stuff of the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is that time period. So the Mycenaean civilization flourished for, I guess, around like 500 years. And then it kind of declined and collapsed. So that's around 500 years of the early civilization. And then there followed around 300 years of what they called a dark age for Greece, where the civilizations kind of died or fell asleep, maybe, right? And I read something like they forgot their own writing system. So everything fragmented. And so during that dark period, I'm sure a lot happened, but I have no idea. I just know that it was a dark period. And then the classical, I'm sorry, this is again still pre-classical. The archaic period slowly emerged from the Dark Age, the Greek Dark Age. So that is 800 BCE, right? So 1100 BCE, that's when the Mycenaean Empire kind of fell apart. And then 800 BCE, that's the archaic period, precursor of the classical Greek period. And archaic period is, we say, when the Mediterranean civilization started, right? So there's a 300 years of dark period. By the time we get to the archaic period, this is a picture I got off the internet, I'm sorry. If I was a, accomplished artist, I would have drawn something like this. The archaic period, it goes from 800 to 480 BCE. Again, 480, that is when the classical period of the Greeks start. So this is a fairly long period, about I guess around 300 years, right? So this is the time when the Greeks developed their characteristics, the characteristics of the classical period. This is when they experimented with their culture, with their religion, when this is the time of Homer. This is when Homer wrote his Iliad and the Odyssey. And the development of the city-states. This is when the city-states developed. Athens, Sparta, and dozens and dozens, I think maybe hundreds and hundreds of Greek city-states sprang up all over the place. So this is the period that um, that nurtured the classical Greeks. This is when Greece matured, when it grew up, and it expanded. It expanded again all over the Mediterranean area. So that is the archaic period. So I'm sorry again for that mistake that I made. So this is the beginning of the Mediterranean classical period. And this leads to the Greek classical period, which is 480 to 323 BCE. Now, please, I hope nobody is confused because of, these mistakes I made. But Greek classical period begins from 480 to 323 BCE. And I gave you this picture of a very famous building. This is called the Parthenon, I think Parthenon, a temple for the Athenians. Parthenon it sits atop this high mountain in the city of Athens, and they called it the Acropolis, the city, and this sits at the top of that mountain, symbol of the Greek classical period. Okay, so that is the background, and of course, after the Athenians, after the Athenians and Spartans, they were taken over by the Macedonian Empire, and that's the most famous figure from the Macedonian Empire, Alexander the Great. And this is a very famous painting, Alexander the Great fighting. This guy is Darius the Third. He's the last king of the Persian Empire. So because he was defeated by Alexander the Great, he died like soon after this battle, and then the Persian Empire fell, and Alexander became its emperor, its king. And with the death of Alexander, the classical Greek period comes to a close, and that is 323. That is when Alexander died. And after that, I think, after that, the Romans came and they took over everything. After that came the Roman Empire. Well, we say the Roman Republic first, and then the Roman Republic uh, degenerated. I don't know if that's the right word. Slowly into the Roman Empire, and they ruled the Mediterranean and beyond for about 500 years, over 500 years, right? Sorry, the Roman Empire ruled for over 500 years. The Roman Republic existed for a lot longer than that, but the empire ruled for about 500 years, beginning with this guy, Augustus Caesar. So, yeah, this is what we say about this whole period. We say the legacy left by Greece and Rome, now known as the Greco-Roman civilization, became the clearest expression of the Mediterranean. And this became the foundations of Western civilization. So, yeah, let's sum up this thing again, because we don't want to be confused, right? Mediterranean civilization, the clearest expression of it is this, what's come to be known as the Greco-Roman. And that ended with the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476. And within that longer time period came the Greeks, 480 to 323. All right. Western Rome ended in 476 CE, but Eastern Rome endured for almost 1,000 years more until 1453. I'm sure we'll talk about this again. I'll talk about it a lot more when I tell the story of Rome. And regarding the Greeks, I'll talk about the classical Greek period more next Tuesday when I tell the story of Athens. There we go. The Persian civilization, again, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because what do I know about Iran? What do I know about Persia? I just realized I have a student from Iran. He's not in this class, but he's in my history of philosophy class. I just realized he's Iranian. I found out. So maybe I can talk to him about what's going on right now in Iran. What are his opinions? The Achaemenid Empire, 550 to 330 BCE, founded by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great. And this was Persia's first golden age. It stretched from Central Asia to the Mediterranean. It had a strong central government. First, they developed the first official postal system. They were very advanced, an advanced people. They also practiced Zoroastrianism, which was a monotheistic religion. So they had a lot of things that were pretty modern according to the standards, the ancient standards of the classical Mediterranean time. They were pretty modern for their age. Postal system, monotheism. And Cyrus the Great, I remember when I first started teaching this course, I had a student from Iran. She was Iranian, and I began to talk about Cyrus the Great as a villain because he's a villain. Um, I thought he was a villain. I was wrong. I was wrong. And then so I started talking about him in a negative way, and then she got upset. She said, nobody talks about Cyrus the Great like that. Don't you know he was a universally beloved, founder of Persia, the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid, the greatest empire. And so I was corrected. I was happily corrected. So Cyrus the Great was a great man. Uh, is a story. So that's the Achaemenid Empire. And of course, he was great, but his not son, the next king, Darius, wasn't because he was foolish enough to invade Greece and he was defeated. And then his son, Xerxes, invaded Greece one more time and he failed. And that was 480 BCE. And that was a turning point. This is what scholars say. That was a turning point for Persia because uh, from that point on, Persia was no longer the undisputed the superpower that it was, and its empire started to decline after the war. And then because Greece became victorious in this war, that's when the golden age started. Later, Persia was conquered by Alexander the Great, and it became Hellenized under the name of Persian Empire became Seleucid Empire. Seleucid because that was the name of one of Alexander's generals. The Seleucid, they were conquered by Rome, and Persia survived, I guess, in the peripheries as the Parthian Empire. Then, this is centuries later now, centuries later, from 224 CE to 651 CE. So they outlived the Roman Empire. The Sasanian Empire revived Persian civilization. So they were, let's see, they were religiously devoted to Zoroastrianism. They revived the Persian culture that had been, as far as they were concerned, infected by Hellenism, right? The Seleucid Empire was Hellenized. It was ruled by a Greek or Macedonian general. So it had become Hellenized, and then the Sasanians revived for them, the ancient Persian ways, especially with the Zoroastrianism. And it was all great. I think this is called the second golden age of Persia. But tragically, I don't know if it's tragic, but they became the victims of the Islamic revolution that happened. This is the post-classical age now. They fell to Islam and the Arabs, and then so this is sort of a sensitive thing to say. uh, I think we can say, on the one hand, this is when Persia kind of died, right? This is when the Persian Empire ended. You could say, on the one hand, it ended because Persia that existed then disappeared, replaced by an Islamic civilization, become an Islamic culture, right? So it's a bit sensitive because I think if you talk to an Iranian, they would say, no, this whole civilization that started with the Achaemenid Empire, it still continues today. Sure, we're Muslims, all of us, but that doesn't mean we deny our tradition, right? Cyrus Great is still the founding father of our nation, of the great nation of Iran. So um, So on the one hand, we could say, yeah, this is when the Persian civilization ended. But on the other hand, we could say, no, it continued and then it was revived, I guess, along with nationalism. This is a very modern phenomenon, right? When everyone became nationalistic, along with nationalism, this idea of the ancient Persian civilization was revived by what is Iran today. So that is Persian civilization. So we covered, let's say uh, we covered Chinese civilization in the classical period. We covered the Indian civilization very briefly. And then we spent a bit more time with the Mediterranean. And within Mediterranean lies Greek and Roman civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization, the clearest expression of the Mediterranean civilization. And then we covered Persian civilization. The Persian civilization, yes, what I said. So this is the second section. I'm going to go through these things a bit more quickly now. Um, so we're going to go through some cultural comparisons of these different civilizations. And then toward the end, the common ways they expanded and integrated their societies. This is based largely on Professor Stern's comparisons. China developed, we say, a markedly secular culture, we say. China's cultural development during the classical period was markedly secular. Um, Confucianism is viewed as perhaps the single most important ideological statement that comes out of Asia or East Asia, right? So Confucianism is a big deal because it shaped the Chinese civilization ever since it got established. So Confucianism is a huge thing that happened during the classical period in China, and Confucianism is markedly secular. It is a very secular system. Whether you like it or not like it, it's a very secular system. And then there was another sort of in contrast to Confucianism was developed what's called legalism. And legalism, in contrast to Confucianism, taught that human nature is evil. And so what is needed is laws to restrict and regulate human behavior. Otherwise, we'll end up killing each other. So legalism was sort of a counterpart to Confucianism, which was a more optimistic, idealistic view of human beings. But Confucianism is, I think, was a much bigger influence, a much bigger presence in Chinese civilization, Chinese culture. And then Taoism originally developed as sort of a philosophical system. It coexisted with Confucianism, sometimes in conflict with, but it mostly peacefully coexisted with Confucianism. I think they talk about it's because they could be complementary to each other. Confucianism was more of a like it has a system, like a political system, how the government should run, how family should be run. Whereas Taoism is more of a like to nature, coexisting with nature, in harmony with nature kind of thing. Taoism's development diverged diverged from Confucianism in that it turned into a religion. Gradually, it evolved into a religion. Taoism, we call it Taoism in English, right? This idea of yin and yang. And then much later on, Buddhism came, and Buddhism was adapted to China. Buddhism, the way it started in India, is very different from Buddhism that got established and developed in China. I'm talking about it very simplistically, but we talk about the smaller vessel Buddhism and the larger vessel Buddhism, the greater vessel Buddhism. Who knows about Buddhism here? Okay, good. I can talk about Buddhism as if I'm the expert. But if I say something that you know to be that's not right, then please let me know. So from what I know of Buddhism, Originally, Buddhism was really more of a philosophy, and that is the smaller vessel Buddhism. Another word for that is Theravada Buddhism. I think that's how you say it. Theravada Buddhism. And the smaller vessel Buddhism is more popular in South Asia right now, in those countries, whereas Buddhism that developed in East Asia, like here in Korea and in China and some other places, that Buddhism is called Mahayana Buddhism, the greater vessel Buddhism. And that is more of a religion than the small vessel Buddhism, which is kind of a religion too, but more so. Mahayana is more so because it has the idea of salvation, right? And bodhisattvas. In Korean, it's posal, bodhisattvas. You can achieve salvation by, believing in and praying to, right? The bodhisattvas. That kind of idea didn't exist in the original Buddhism. It was more of a philosophical system. So Chinese culture is a mixture of conflicting secular and spiritual impulses, spiritual as in like Taoism and Buddhism, but on the whole, it was clearly secular because of Confucianism and legalism and other schools of thoughts like that. So that is Chinese culture during the classical period. The way China developed its characteristics was markedly secular and getting along with various types of religions. India was, we're comparing the four civilizations here, right? Was the most spiritual of the civilizations during this period. Brahmanism, based on the Vedas and later on developed into Hinduism, the Indian culture was the most spiritual. Buddhism was founded toward the end of the Vedic period and flourished in India for a while and other countries. But then Buddhism started dying out in India. But then by then it was spreading to other countries. I'll talk about this, India being the most spiritual again in a bit. So India was by far the most spiritual. Persia had a strong monotheistic religious tradition. Zoroastrianism was founded by this guy named Zarathustra or Zoroaster. So it's called Zoroastrianism. Zarathustra is also the title of a book by Nietzsche, Thus Spec, Thus Spec Zoroastra. It taught the belief in one God, Ahura Mazda, the creator of the universe, the source of all goodness. It had a very strong sense of ethics. It had the sense that the world was a place of light and dark, good and evil. It's a place of struggle. And we who are the faithful believers of Ahura Mazda, we must fight on the side of the good. We must be on the side of the light. Its priests were called Magi, if you know that word, Magi. And they had this idea of keeping the sacred fire alive. So Zoroastrianism, it still exists today. It's a very small minority religion in Iran now and in some other locations, but it's a small minority religion in Iran, but it's still alive. Apparently, I don't think they call themselves magi anymore. The priests, Zoroastrian priests, they still keep this sacred fire. They've been keeping it alive for like apparently some thousands of years. It's their job to make sure the fire never dies out. It's this holy fire of the Zoroastrians, it's still kept alive somewhere in some places in Iran. Magi, I was going to say, if you're familiar with that word, that's because Magi, we identify them with the three wise men from the East. The nativity scene, baby Jesus, follow the star of Bethlehem, right? Three wise men from the East, and sometimes they're called the Magi. So the implication is that they were Zoroastrians, that you could easily think, oh, Ahura Mazda, oh, they're talking about the God of Abraham, right? You could see the parallels, the similarities. The Sasanian Empire made Zoroastrian. So I talked about that. Right, kind of went downhill with the Seleucids, the Hellenized, seen as sort of an infection in Persian culture. But the Sasanian Empire purified Persia, made Zoroastrianism its state religion. But then it declined when Persia was conquered by the Muslim Arabs, right? So I talked about that already. The the Mediterranean, classical Mediterranean, was somewhat like China in its culture. It had a strong strain of secular thought coexisting with spiritual impulses. So there's a lot of similarity between Mediterranean civilization and Chinese civilization during the classical period. The secular strain is obviously Western philosophy. That happened during this period. I mean, you could say started happening before, but it really got going with Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. These figures that we still learn from today that became part of Greek culture at this time. They had strong religious beliefs too. They all believed in the gods, but these gods were polytheistic, and the religion that developed in Greece was nothing like Zoroastrianism or Judaism that developed in the Middle East, in that the gods were much like human beings, right? They would play, they would party, and they would have, affairs with human beings. Gods would get jealous. They were basically like, superheroes with a lot more power, but they acted like human beings. Uh, and then the Greek gods would later turn into the Roman gods, like Zeus would become Jupiter, I believe. And then later on, this is still during the classical period, something big happened to the Mediterranean civilization, which is Christianity. Christianity happened, which is, depending on the way you view it, depending on the way you see Christianity, it is probably the most important thing that happened in history, even if you're not Christian, right? Because it literally divides history into two, before Christianity and after Christianity. And that happened in the Mediterranean um, region. Christianity came out of Judaism. At first, it was persecuted, severely persecuted, and then later on, a few centuries later, it took over Rome with Emperor Constantine. Uh, and then it led to the Christianized Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, which continued to throughout the post-classical period. So that's their culture. I think I just realized I'm running out of time now. I thought I had lots of time. That's when I had to be careful. The political comparisons. China, Persia, Rome all had strong centralized governments and powerful rulers. So this was a common strain in all the classical civilizations. China, Persia, Rome all had strong centralized governments. But China had the biggest system with an unusually large bureaucracy. At this time, it had the largest bureaucracy in the world. About 1% of the total population worked for the government. That was the structure they built. It was the best system, political system, uh, even better than the Romans. The Han started civil service exams and built educational training schools for scholars. No other empire came close to China's system, the political system that they developed. Roman Empire came closest to China. It also developed a large bureaucracy, a stable system of governance with Roman laws and regulations, which, by the way, still survives today, the Roman laws, but it was not as big or developed as China's. Um, Professor Stern said something like, when the hard times came, when the dynasty failed and the Roman Empire fell, the Roman system did not come back, right? Its political system did not come back. It left its legacy, but it did not come back. But the Chinese system came back because even when it was conquered, even when others took over the Chinese system, they could not imagine a better system than the one that was already there. So the political system kept surviving through different rulers, different dynasties. Persia had absolute monarchy with centralized rule, but it delegated power to regional governors. I think they call them precepts. So it did have a centralized government, but a lot of their its power was delegated. A little bit like a feudal system. It was more distributed. They say India was unlike the other three in that it had decentralized smaller states with less emphasis on political ideas and ideologies, less interference in governance. And the reason that was given for this, why did India not have this strong central government, was because of their political structure, their societal structure, because of their caste system. This is a unique thing that happened in India. The caste system, based on the religion, right, took over the entire society. And because the caste system was a very strict hierarchy, and it naturally supported a kind of feudal system where the upper class, the Brahmins or the warrior class, they were naturally the rulers. That was the natural order of things, right? So you wouldn't have rebellions. You wouldn't have people grumbling and complaining because they were all harmonious in their society. If you were part of the Vaishya, the merchant class, that was your place in society. If you were the commoners, peasants, servants, that was your place in society. So the caste system on its own um, held the society together. Hence, less motivation for there to be strong centralized government. So even if the government didn't interfere, the society just ran along on its own through the caste system. So caste obligation served many political functions. It took over a lot of the political functions. The Mediterranean civilization was unique in that it had democracy. That was a unique thing that the Greeks had, and the Romans had as well until it turned into an empire. But even when it turned into an empire, it kept the guise, it kept the forms, the facade of a republic. It started with the Greek city-states. Rome also rejected kings and became a republic. It had executive, legislative, judicial branches. If these are familiar to us, because we have inherited their system, division of power, separation of powers, right, into the executive, legislative, judicial branches, first practiced by the Greeks. Every citizen was under the Roman law or the Athenian law. The whole system was a unique thing that developed during the archaic period, right? It started with the archaic period. And then by the time we get to the classical, like Athenian, Spartan, the Golden Age, these things are already well established. Even as empire, the Roman Empire, it kept the trappings of the Republic. The Romans did not bow down to their emperor. For example, it's just an example, right? But it's a telling example of the contrast in terms of how they dealt with each other, telling example of how the Mediterranean system was different. So I have some pictures here. This is a Persian king, a citizen, I guess someone coming toward the king, and you had to crawl. You had to bow down and crawl and kiss the king's foot. You had to kiss his foot before you could, I get on your knees and, talk to him. The Chinese system was the same. You had to bow down. This is still an Asian thing. We bow down to the rulers. The Romans did not bow down. Here's the emperor and here's the soldier, right? You stand. You stand because you are equal under the Roman law, right? The Roman emperor was not the same kind of emperor the Chinese emperor was. Chinese emperor was the yellow emperor, like sort of a divine figure. The Roman emperor was, I guess, how did they put it? The first citizen. He was a citizen, just like everyone else. It's just that he was first, right? He was the proconsul. He was the commander of the army. I'm getting ahead of things. Commander of the army. The title of the commander of the army was the Imperator. Imperator. That's actually where we get the name emperor. That's the English name. The emperor was the commander of the army. I think I am running out of time. We still have a few pages to go, slides to go. Let me stop with this. So we just covered the political comparisons, social comparisons, and then we still have a few more pages to go, which is fine. I think what I'm going to do is Tuesday, I'm not going to talk about this. Tuesday, I'm going to spend all our time talking about Athens, the story of Athens, and then we'll continue with this Thursday. If you have questions, please use the Q&A. Otherwise, have a wonderful week.